Sometime in the 6th century before Christ, a Greek poet went blind, and he was certain he knew why. His name was Stesichorus, and he was famous, one of the great lyric poets of his age, the kind of man whose verses were sung across the Greek world. He had written a poem about Helen of Troy, and it said what everyone's poem said about Helen, that she was the woman who ran off with a Trojan prince, who abandoned her husband and her child, who lit the fire that burned a city and killed a generation of heroes. The face that launched 1,000 ships, the most beautiful woman in the world and the most guilty. And then, the story goes, he lost his sight. He became convinced it was punishment that Helen herself, who was worshipped as a goddess in some parts of Greece, had struck him blind for the insult. So he did something no other poet is remembered for doing. He wrote a second poem that took the first one back. The Greeks had a word for a poem like that, a song that reverses a song, and it comes down to us almost unchanged, a PALI. When you hear a public figure issue a careful retraction today, the word for it was invented for this exact moment, a blind man trying to unsay what he had said about Helen. And according to the tradition, when he finished it, his sight came back. Now, you could file that under superstition and move on. But the interesting thing is not that he recanted. The interesting thing is what he recanted to. Because Stesichorus did not simply write that Helen was innocent, or that she had been forced, or that the gods had made her do it. He wrote something far stranger. He wrote that Helen was never at Troy at all, not the affair, not the guilt, the whole thing. The most famous woman in the story was, he now claimed, never even there. And he was not the only serious mind in Greece who came to believe it. To feel how strange that claim is, you have to hold the ordinary version clearly first. Everyone knows it. Helen is the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, daughter of Zeus, the most beautiful woman alive. A Trojan prince named Paris comes to Sparta as a guest, and while he is under Menelaus's roof, eating his food, he takes Helen and sails home to Troy with her. Whether she is seduced or willing or carried off by force depends on who is telling it, but the outcome is the same. She ends up behind the walls of Troy, and Menelaus wants her back. So the Greeks come for her. Not a raiding party, a coalition. Every king who had once sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage is bound to sail, and they bring 1,000 ships and the greatest warriors of the age. Achilles, Ajax, Odysseus. For 10 years they camp on the beach below Troy, and they die there in the thousands over this one woman behind the wall. And Homer puts her on that wall. In the Iliad, in one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the poem, Helen stands on the ramparts of Troy beside the old King Priam and looks down at the Greek army, at her own countrymen, at the husband she left. And she names the heroes one by one, and she calls herself a horror, a thing dogs should be ashamed of. Homer's Helen is not a prize. She is a woman living inside the consequences of her own story, watching men die in her name and hating what she has become. This is the Helen the whole world inherited. The Helen of the Iliad, the Helen of every painting and every film, the woman at Troy. Guilty or not, forced or not, she is there. The war is about a real woman in a real city, and the tragedy is that she is close enough to watch it. Take that away, and the entire war loses its object. Which is precisely what the next set of sources does. Go back to Stesichorus and his Pali node, and to the thing he claimed instead. The gods, he said, made an eidolon. That is a Greek word worth keeping, eidolon, an image, a likeness, a phantom. It is the root of the English word idol, a breathing image of Helen, indistinguishable from her, shaped out of air. And it was this phantom that Paris carried off to Troy. It was this phantom the Greeks besieged for 10 years. It was this phantom on the wall beside Priam. The real Helen never boarded the ship. She never saw Troy. The most destructive war in Greek memory was fought, for a decade, over a woman who was not there, over an image of her. If that were a single eccentric poet, it would be a footnote. It is not. A century and a half later, the great Athenian playwright Euripides built an entire tragedy on it, a play simply called Helen, staged in 412 before Christ, and its premise is exactly this. In Euripides, the goddess Hera is furious that Paris awarded the prize of beauty to Aphrodite instead of her, and she takes her revenge by cheating Paris of the reward. She makes the phantom and hands that to Troy. And the real Helen, the innocent one, who never betrayed anyone, she is spirited away to Egypt, to the household of a king named Theocaliamenus, son of the sea god Prohtius, where Helen waits out the entire war, faithful and frantic, while 10,000 men kill each other over her ghost. Picture the scene Euripides gives his audience. The war is over. Troy has fallen. Menelaus, shipwrecked and exhausted, washes up on the shore of Egypt and finds his wife, the real one. Alive, untouched, having been there the whole time. And he cannot understand it because he is quite sure he has just spent 10 years fighting to win her back, and he thinks, the woman he recovered from Troy on his ship. 2 Helens. One of them is about to dissolve into air. An Athenian audience sat and watched that. The same city that revered Hohmer watched a play whose entire foundation was that Hohmer's central event never happened, and nobody rioted. To the Greeks, this was not blasphemy. It was another version, and they held it alongside the first without apparent discomfort. But the strangest witness is not the poet or the playwright. It is the man who called himself a historian. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before Christ, is often called the father of history, the first Greek we know of who tried to travel, gather accounts, weigh them, and explain the past as a chain of human causes rather than divine whims. And when he came to Egypt and asked the priests there about Helen, he came away convinced that the Troy story was wrong. But he fixed it in a completely different way from the poets. Herodotus keeps no phantom. He has no patience for a woman made of air. His version is ruthlessly down to earth. Paris, he says, did take Helen, the real Helen, from Sparta. But on the voyage back to Troy, a storm blew them off course and drove them to Egypt. And the Egyptian king, when he learned that this guest had stolen another man's wife and treasure, was disgusted. He refused to let Paris take her any further. He kept Helen in Egypt, safe and untouched, and sent Paris on to Troy empty-handed. So, and this is the part that turns the whole war into tragedy of a new kind. When the Greeks arrived and demanded Helen back, the Trojans told them the truth. She is not here. She is in Egypt. We do not have her. And the Greeks did not believe them. They could not believe that a city would endure a 10-year siege rather than give up one woman, so they concluded the Trojans were lying, and they pressed the war to the end. Troy burned. And only afterward, Herodotus says, when they had sacked the city and searched it and found no Helen, did they finally understand the Trojans had been telling the truth the entire time. Now line the three of them up, because the differences are the whole point. Stesichorus, a phantom made by the gods. Euripides, a phantom made by Hera, plus the real Helen hidden in Egypt. Herodotus, no phantom at all, just a real woman held in Egypt and a catastrophic failure to believe the truth. 3 men, 3 centuries, all reaching the same destination. Helen was not at Troy by 3 completely different roads. One makes it a miracle. One makes it a staged tragedy. One makes it an investigation and strips out every trace of the supernatural. And Herodotus adds a detail he clearly thought was evidence. In Egypt, in Memphis, he says he saw with his own eyes a temple to what the locals called the foreign Aphrodite. And he became convinced it was really a shrine to Helen, that her stay in Egypt had left a mark on the ground you could still visit. He is doing what a historian does. He is pointing at a building and saying, something happened here. We should be honest about what that is worth. A temple is not proof that Helen stood in Egypt any more than the walls of Troy are proof that she stood there. These are stories that grew shrines, not shrines that prove stories. There is almost certainly no true Helen underneath any of it to be located. But that raises the real question, the one that is actually interesting. Not where Helen was. Why so many Greeks needed her not to be at Troy. Because the impulse to get Helen out of Troy is older and deeper than Stesichorus, and you can find its fingerprints in the very poem that supposedly puts her there. Go to the 4th book of the Odyssey. The war is long over. Menelaus is home in Sparta, and Helen is there beside him. The marriage somehow resumed, and they are hosting the young Telemachus, who has come looking for news of his father. The evening turns painful with memories of the war, and everyone at the table is close to weeping. And Helen does something curious. She slips a drug into the wine, a medicine that dissolves grief, that makes a man unable to cry even if his own brother were killed in front of him. Homer names it, and he tells us where she learned it. She got it in Egypt. Sit with that. Homer, the source, the man who put Helen at Troy, casually tells us that Helen has Egyptian pharmacology, Egyptian knowledge, an Egyptian past. The thread that ties Helen to Egypt is not a later invention bolted on by embarrassed poets. It is already there in the oldest telling, humming quietly under the official story. The tradition that would eventually pull her all the way out of Troy and set her down on the Nile had a seed inside Homer himself. And there is a reason that seed kept growing, and it is not literary. It is religious. In Sparta, Helen's own city, the place she supposedly betrayed, Helen was not remembered as a scandal. She was worshipped as a goddess. There was a sanctuary, the Menelaon, where Helen and Menelaus received the offerings owed to divine beings. Spartan women prayed to Helen for beauty. She had cult, ritual, a god's honors. And that changes everything about the phantom, because you cannot comfortably worship an adulteress. A community that pours offerings to Helen as a goddess has a problem with the Helen of the Iliad, the one who runs off with Paris and gets a generation killed. The phantom solves it. The Egyptian exile solves it. If the woman at Troy was only an image, then the real Helen, the goddess you pray to, kept her hands clean. She was in Egypt the whole time, faithful, wronged, waiting. The theology needed an innocent Helen, and the poets built her one, and they built her a place to have been instead. This is the thing underneath all three versions. They are not competing memories of what happened. They are competing solutions to the same discomfort. How to keep the most beautiful woman in the world, and a goddess besides, from being the villain of your civilization's greatest story. So was Helen ever at Troy? The honest answer runs the other way from the mystery. There is no historical Helen to locate in Troy or in Egypt or anywhere else. This is myth, and the phantom is almost certainly not a memory of anything. If a real woman lies at the very bottom of the story, the oldest and fullest version we have puts her on the wall at Troy, watching, named by Homer, hating herself. Weighed as evidence, that is where the story starts. But the phantom is the more revealing invention, and it tells you something the Iliad cannot. It tells you that an entire culture would rather believe its most famous war was fought over nothing, over an image, a trick of the gods, a 10-year slaughter with no woman at the end of it, than believe that Helen was guilty. Think about the size of that. They were willing to make the Trojan War meaningless. They were willing to say that Achilles and Ajax and all those thousands died for a phantom, for a ghost that dissolved into air the moment the fighting stopped, rather than let the goddess they prayed to carry the blame. That is the choice buried in the Pali node. Not Helen was innocent, plenty of stories say that. But we will move the war itself. We will empty it of its cause. We will let the whole thing be for nothing before we will let her be at fault. A blind poet felt that pressure and rewrote the world to relieve it, and got his eyes back for it. And the Greeks kept his version next to Homer's for 1,000 years without ever deciding between them. There is one loose thread the phantom leaves hanging, and the Greeks never quite tied it off. If the woman at Troy was only an image, then every man who died beneath those walls died for something that was not there. The greatest heroes of the age, the whole age of heroes ending in the mud below Troy, spent for a ghost. The poets who moved Helen to Egypt to keep her clean never seem to have asked what that does to the men they left behind on the beach. Maybe that is a question for another night, because one of those men spent 10 more years trying to get home from that war, and there is a version of how his story ends too, that Homer did not tell.